Oh yeah, good fish. These fish are so freaking confused. They just don't know what to do or where to go. And this fish is running off with my bait. I'm yapping at the camera and not paying attention. It's one of my little baits. I put 3 rods out with smaller hooks and little pieces of cut bait, and then I put 2 or 3 rods out with big baits. There we go. That was all it took. Just move that bait about 6 inches. I tightened that line up, and after I tightened the line up, the fish started popping it, picked it up, and then let go. So I just picked the rod up, dragged it about 6, 8, 10 inches towards me, and then held it still. And as soon as I stopped, it popped it. This fish has got mud all over it. I don't know how well this is going to show up. Let me get in the sunlight here. I don't know how well this is going to show up on camera, but it's covered in mud. Now make sure you stay tuned all the way to the end of this video. I'm going to go in depth as to some specific information about these catfish being buried down in the mud, when and why they do that, or at least my theory on it, and how to tell when that's going on. So make sure you watch all the way through. That one's getting bit right now. Never fails. Go ahead and get this one put out. I went out to catch bait and I marked a lot of shad, and when my net was hitting them, I was pulling up 8 or 10 of them, and they were gilled in the net. That fish is on there. Come on, turn for me, turn for me. Don't get caught up in that other fishing line. And they were little shad that were gilling in the net. I say little, they're probably 5 inches, but my taped net that I was throwing, just too big of a mesh in that deep water, and they were swimming through it. So usually when that happens, you start catching shad like that are gilled, but you're seeing tons of them on the fish finder. You're just losing a bunch of them. A bunch of the little ones are just swimming through the net. So I just got enough to fish for a little while, since I wasn't going to be here very long. The same thing. You see that? That's mud. If you notice, so that fish had a float, or that rig had a float on it, a Santee rig. But the majority of the fish that I have caught have been on this rod right here. I've caught, I think, 4 fish and probably missed 4 or 5 bites. And this rod does not have a float on it. It's just a regular old slip sinker rig. It's sitting down on the bottom. That feels like that might be a better fish. I think it's a catfish. It sure is fighting funny. Oh yeah, good fish. Good fish. Let's see here. Fish is full of piss and vinegar. This is the challenge fishing by yourself. There we go. Go ahead and get that one back in the water. I screwed up. I run off and left my bait cooler in my truck. I don't have anything to cut my bait on. I'm just using these scissors. But I just caught that fish on a little old bitty threadfin shad head like that. And a 6/0 triple threat hook. I've got some bigger baits out there right now, but thus far, every bite I've had has been on these little tiny baits. That one's getting bit too. The fish is running. Oh, I pulled it out of its mouth. Missed another one. Hard one. Oh, it's still on there. It was swimming at me. Swimming at me. I never felt it till I got it right up there at the side of the boat. What you think, Skeeter? Man, I just had a big bite right here on this one. I was scrambling to get the camera turned on. My bite kind of slowed down where I was fishing, and I was getting lots of little bites, but it was those channel cat bites. They just popping at it, wiggling the rod tip. I was losing a bunch of bait, wasn't catching fish. So I pulled up and moved. Got another fish on up here. I was trying to get a bait to bait that rod, that fish I just pulled in, and this one's already gotten hammered. I sure wish I've caught a lot of numbers. I sure wish I'd get a big slammer on one of my big baits. Just hadn't happened yet. I marked some big fish right here on my side imaging, which is why I stopped right here. I don't have a whole lot of time left. I'm gonna lose my daylight. Let me have that bait back.
Why do these fish bury down in the mud? When do they do it? How do you find them? And then how do you catch them? So this is something that I see that really happens through like October, mid-October, late October, through about mid-March here in Texas. I have never noticed it happening in the summertime. It has something to do with the cold. I don't know if these fish get down in there because it's warmer down in that mud, or if it has something to do with pressure. When we have big cold fronts come through, and the water gets really cold, which is typically associated with really high barometric pressure, that is when these fish will bury down in that mud, and you'll start to catch those fish that are just covered in it, top to bottom, front to back. So how do you find them? How do you tell that those fish are buried down in the mud? So a few things. Obviously, when you have cold water and you have a big front and the pressure is high, you're going to be looking for those fish buried down in the mud. So there's a few things that you can do. One, side imaging is really, really helpful when the fish are like this. You can tell when you're looking at side imaging where the fish are related to the bottom. So the further a fish is away from its shadow on that side imaging indicates how far off the bottom it is. The closer it is to the shadow, the closer it is to the bottom. And if it's right down on the bottom or buried down in the mud, you may see very little shadow at all, if not any shadow. But you're going to be able to see that hard return from the fish. So you can tell on that side imaging if you're not seeing any shadows and you get that hard return. You can usually still tell that they're catfish because of the way the return looks. Catfish are typically brighter in those returns. They'll show up a brighter white than other fish. Bigger fish are easier to see when they're buried down in the mud like that. The smaller fish can be a little bit more difficult. But the other thing is, if you're out in deeper water, I'd say water more than about 10 or 15 feet or so, look in that deeper water, look on your 2D sonar. There's a setting on Humminbird fish finders. I'm not sure if Lowrance or Garmin and the other ones have it, but there is a white line setting where you can go in and you can add a white line that goes across the bottom on the 2D and the down imaging sonar. I'm going to show you what this looks like here. But you're going to see those fish in relation to that white line. And usually what will happen is you can see the arches just barely above that white line. And that's a good way for you to go in and tell that those fish are buried down in the mud like that. So what do you do when you get in these conditions and you're struggling with these fish? Well, drifting is a great way to catch fish in these conditions, but you're going to want to slow that drift way down. Now, if you saw in this video, I wasn't drifting. I was fishing anchored, and I was catching fish. I know there was a lot of those fish that were buried down in that mud that weren't moving around, but there were fish that I marked here where I was fishing that I know were just buried down in there and they weren't moving around feeding. So you can drift, you slow that drift way, way down. You downsize hooks and downsize baits, because typically when you get in these conditions, these fish don't want to eat big baits. You fish a smaller bait. I usually will downsize as small as about the size of a quarter. You can experiment with larger and smaller baits, just see what the fish want, let them tell you what they want. Smaller hooks, 6/0, 8/0 triple threat is what I was using on this trip. I kind of had a combination of both. I was catching fish on both, but I caught every one of the fish that I caught, I believe, on those 6/0 hooks and the smaller quarter size baits. Didn't catch any fish on the big baits that I had out. Didn't even get bit on those bigger baits. And then the other thing is where these baits are in relation to the bottom. So shorten those leaders up. Typically, wintertime, I'll fish 18 to 24 inch leaders, sometimes even longer than that. When I have conditions like this where these fish are buried down in the mud, I'm going to shorten those leaders up to about 12 to 18 inches, get those baits down closer to the bottom. And again, oftentimes I'll take those floats off. So what I'm going to do in these conditions is I'm going to take some of the floats off, leave some of them on. So I have part Santee rigs and part slip sinker rigs, and just let the fish see what they want or tell you what they want. But more often when you get in these conditions and the fish are buried down in the mud, you're gonna catch a whole lot more fish on shorter leaders without a float on them, just a regular old slip sinker rig to get those baits down in the bottom and right in front of the faces of those fish. So that's some tips on finding and catching these catfish when they're buried down in the mud. I've got all sorts of other information out there if you want to up your game and really get more information on these topics. A book on drift fishing, a book on finding and catching shad, a book on catching catfish in the spring. You can head over to catfishedge.com and check all those out. Make sure you hit that thumbs up button, subscribe, and hit that bell notification, and I'll be back next week. Until next time, I'm Chad Ferguson, catfishedge.com.